Hi, you've reached the voicemail of Hannah Brett with Connect Call. Just leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks.
1 for more options.
Hey, Hannah. We got your number from a psychiatrist we're working with. My son has just turned 18, but as an adolescent, we have tried every modality, every therapist. We've tried outpatient, PHP. We've also tried a couple stints in residential treatment where my son ran as an adolescent. And we're kind of now working with an interventionist, but to find maybe trying a different approach and looking at wilderness treatment. I know there's some great programs out there as well as some bad programs, and we're looking to get steered in the right direction. So I was hoping you could call me back and give us some guidance. I look forward to your call, and thank you.
Hi, this is Hannah Brett, and here we are for another episode of Connect Call, where I often say I do not have a clinical background, but I do have a PhD for picking up the phone for families in crisis over the past 20 years. Derek Daley is the co-founder of Legacy Treatment Center and Juniper Canyon Recovery Center, which are both young adult programs. He serves also as the president of the National Association of Therapeutic Schools and Programs, otherwise known as NATSAP. For more than 2 decades, he has advanced wilderness therapy, outdoor behavioral health care, and addiction treatment through program development, long-term outcome research, public policy, and field leadership. And I can go on and on about you, Derek. You have a foundation where you have raised funds to scholarship a lot of these kids to be able to access treatment. And it was important to have someone like you on the show to clear up a lot of stuff that's, misconceptions out there, over the years. And so I just wanted to say welcome to the show and thank you so much for being here. I think, why it was really important first and foremost to have you on this show was there are good apples and there are bad apples. When people hear the term wilderness therapy today, many immediately think of stories in the headlines like of what Paris Hilton went through and how this has kind of shaped this perception. Unfortunately, what I've seen is a lot of our colleagues and friends and really great programs have to close their doors because parents really believed that was the norm for everything you would hear of wilderness. Even recently when I was just saying to Derek, I was trying to refer a young woman to Juniper Canyon. And mind you, Legacy Outdoors and Juniper Canyon, I have been working personally for years, and you guys do amazing, amazing work. You have this brilliant bridge of residential component with this wilderness piece. We were talking to a family about Juniper Canyon, and immediately they go, oh, no. It's going to be like what Paris Hilton went through, or, my kid's going to get snatched in the middle of the night, and they immediately go there. Right. And so I wanted to clear up some things. And also, although you guys just treat young adults, I think also where wilderness gets looped into the troubled teen industry, which I will talk time and time again about how that is a completely different beast than the treatment that I refer to that we work with. As soon as I see troubled teen in someone's mission statement or behavioral modification in their mission statement, I kind of run and tell families to run. How did that kind of shape the public perception out there? In your opinion?
Great question. I mean, first, let me start by saying, hey, thanks for having me on, Hannah. I think hosting these conversations is so important, being able to pull back the curtain on this field so that we can learn together, improve together, increase transparency. I think it's so important in behavioral health care. And I think it's something that we all got to invest in as how do we create context and how do we learn together? How do we improve together? And that's certainly what I've seen. I think that, obviously, in regards to Paris and wilderness therapy and her story and her advocacy, I think it shined a light. And, I'll share for a little bit from personally. When I discovered wilderness therapy in the early 2000s, I felt like I discovered magic. It was incredible. And what I experienced was so personally profound. I watched people, and I think it's so intuitive, right? I have these conversations with people over and over again, just one-on-one and just their own context, like connecting with nature just as a baseline, like people understand that. And wilderness therapy is a way of really tapping into that power that today we have more research than ever before that supports how important it is to find ways to connect not just youth or adolescents, adult, anyone, to nature components, and it's going to improve our health. And I'm a big believer in that. And I experienced it firsthand 20 years ago, first gathering around those fires in the Utah desert. I watched people having these profound healing experiences. They were sleeping under the stars. They were gathering around a fire and sharing their souls. And I was sharing mine. And it just, I didn't know it at the time, but I now know years later, I discovered a purpose and a passion. And from that moment, another thing that was going on for me at that time is I had family members who were struggling with mental health and substance abuse. And subsequently, I lost family members to what I view as poor behavioral health care services. And I discovered something at the same time that I thought could be a real answer. And so it really set me on a mission of like, how do we make this more accessible to more families? Because I thought it was that powerful. And so you can imagine, I discovered this thing. It's beautiful. I mean, these field guides out there, they're compassionate. They got backpacks on. Like the type of people drawn to this work are healers, right? And so I come into this work and that's 20 years ago. And we work. And during that time, I get to work with Dr. Maddie Liebing and Gil Hallows, and I get to pick up some of their work, which they had been doing a lot of advocacy within the state to increase policy, to increase accountability, to raise standards, to implement accreditation. And so by the time I got on the scene, a lot of these programs, including the ones Paris went to, they were closed.
Yeah.
And so some of the worst actors, like the Netflix series on Challenger, they were closed a decade before I even came on the scene. And so I don't have any firsthand experience with, like, I guess what would be called the old school sort of boot camp model and that. But I think, one of the interesting things, if we want to tell the whole story, right, is some of the early wilderness experiences. Early practitioners basically took people from colleges or areas and took them out on these experiences. And what they found was it was very effective. And then from that, it grew. And then what happened was you had corporations come in and programs and people buying in and sort of trying to, I think, more profit off of what was a really and is a very powerful experience. And I think that's where, if I track it back, I think you see some of the bad practices and actors coming in. But I think an untold story often, or overlooked story, is that this field, wilderness therapy and just behavioral health care in general, when you go on the ground and you meet practitioners and people doing this work, the vast majority of them they're healers themselves. They're compassionate. And many of them have their own stories of wounding in this field. And that drives them to sort of raise the bar. And so, I just, as I do this work as a NatSat president, and I get to visit programs and I get to visit people, what I see is people doing the very best they can to elevate care and protect people. That's the motivation. And so when Paris comes on the scene with some of this stuff and raise it, I see it as more or less a good thing, because it's to me, what I see is a shared agenda, which is how do we increase safety, how do we increase effectiveness, and how do we make it easier for families who are in search finding good programs? How can we tell a good program from a bad one? And the better we can do that in behavioral health care, the better it's going to be for all of us. It's a little harder in behavioral health care than it is in medical care, right? Because it is a little more subjective, I think. But I think, what I would bring to the conversation is context. Who are the populations being served? What does their risk profile look like at home? What does their risk profile look like in wilderness therapy? What does the effectiveness look like? And how good can we evidence this stuff? And and today, the cool part is we've got things like the Wilderness Therapy Safety Report that really dove in and try to answer some of these questions. And one of the things that just discovered, right, this deep dive, is that clients, students, are 6.5 times safer in wilderness therapy than they are in their own homes. Right.
Say that again. Repeat that statistic.
So specifically, it's looking at the likelihood of like a serious incident in wilderness therapy. They're 6.5 times more likely to experience that living their regular life than in wilderness
Right.
therapy. Now, some context there is we're working often with a higher risk population. So you add that. What does that tell us? It tells us that these interventions are very safe. Now, what's important is you got to be looking at licensed and accredited programs. And as somebody who's been on site as an accreditor of programs and not provided them accreditation because they didn't meet the standards, that's evidence that we're headed in the right direction. So yeah, when being on the ground visiting programs to do the accreditation, when a program didn't meet those standards, we were able to immediately provide recommendations. In some of those cases, those programs closed. And so, that's the important work, is how do we pull back the curtain to
Right.
ensure programs are
Right.
providing the level of care that we expect? And I think what the survivor community has in this field itself is a lot of motivated leaders who share the same goal. And I think that we can evidence a lot of that. Now, when it comes to wilderness therapy specifically, to this day, there's nothing that I have found that I believe more in than the power of going out on a rites of passage experience, a hero's journey, and spending time just having that healing journey. I think
Right.
particularly right now with some of the issues that we see with this generation of isolation, screen time, process addiction,
Yes.
less time outside. I think it's needed now more than ever. And in fact, one
Correct.
of the things I'll share right now, which is my favorite piece of research on nature connectedness, when we take people into nature, three big outcomes that we see is it increases self-love, it increases our compassion for others, and it increases our care for the natural world or the earth. What three better outcomes could we hope for than
Yeah.
those three
So
outcomes?
true.
And so, I'm looking to expand wilderness therapy, but not just in the traditional form of wilderness therapy, but how do we provide earlier opportunities for people to connect with nature? I do think it's really sad and unfortunate that the wilderness therapy word itself got hijacked by some programs that I never even got to see.
Right.
And that sort of shaped the view. And I think a lot of
Right.
people in this field actually struggled continuing to call what they do wilderness therapy.
Right.
I want to be honest and upfront, and I think what we do is wilderness therapy, and I think it's powerful, and I think that
Right.
that I want to be a part of like taking the honor back of what that is, and not let the worst case scenarios hijack the term.
And I think that's so important to say, like, over the years of me representing adolescent and young adult programs, I did not represent a wilderness program, but I did represent a lot of adolescent programs. And where I saw even the adolescent programs get hijacked is by this troubled teen industry, or this, as I say to families time and time again, if you see the word troubled teen or behavioral modification in the mission statement, that really has nothing to do with any evidence-based, true adolescent treatment, and definitely has nothing to do with what's going on with wilderness. And I feel like I can just speak firsthand in the 20 years that I've been doing this, where the work you guys have done has really hit that sweet spot, is for those individuals, for those young adults and adolescents who they needed this kind of wilderness intervention of sorts, that we were finding in that traditional residential setting. It wasn't enough, or just with what we were seeing at home and how they were showing up and not showing up. The best kind of intervention that could have happened is them to be plucked out of their daily life, behind the screen and hiding in their bedroom, and just kind of going out into the wild in a way, and and time again, I will say this, and I'm not just saying this because I have Derek on the show and because, we're doing this episode. I personally have not had an experience where this hasn't been effective. Of course, just like any other program, just like anything else, there are, again, bad apples, and there also have been unfortunate situations, right? But the mass majority, and at least the cases that I've worked on, and this is going to sound horrible. Well, not horrible, but like I can think of right now, there was a therapist worked at a treatment at a wilderness program. His name was Griff. I think you know Griff very well, and I hope you do. And he no longer does this work. But what was so amazing about him is when I had cases of especially young men that nobody else could get to, nobody else's voice or treatment could really have an effect on these young men, and they were just, their behavior was off the charts. They were running from programs or stealing cars, and you name it, their behavior was off the charts. He was somewhat of a, you know, he was this whisperer of sorts that was able to get through the treatment in the wilderness setting, and also just of who he was. And that's the magic in the work we do. You know what I mean? And I think it goes into my next question. I think, for families out there looking at programs, what are some of the red flags that families should be aware of, of things to, go, this probably is not a good place for my child to go.
Yeah. I mean, right off the top, you're going to want to look for programs that are licensed and accredited by an accrediting body. So you're looking at AEE, Joint Commission, those are important because what that tells you is they're being audited by an outside third party
Mm,
to make sure they're adhering to best practices. And having gone through that process many, many times and also being on the ground as a creditor, it's a deep dive. And, every time you go through those processes, you're hit with some recommendations for improvement. And I've seen that only improve over time. Best practices are constantly evolving and we're working to do those things. And so right off the bat, I would do that. The other piece that I always tell families is a program should be able to evidence in some way that they do what they say they do. So there should
thank
be
you.
some program evaluation that shows some transparency. If
Yes.
we treat anxiety or if we're an eating disorder, I mean, you just name it, right? If we say this
Right.
is what we do, we should have some method of saying this is what our results look like.
Right.
And ideally, that could be program evaluation and there's a lot of ways to get that information to study it. And in even working with researchers to publish research would be the
Right.
next level of that, right? And that's how we push the field forward. I think that there's always, I think in behavioral healthcare, there's been this like fear of like I've got the special sauce and I don't want to share it. Where in the
Right.
medical field, when you see advancement, it spreads quickly. And I think that
Mm,
we need to adopt that same philosophy that like,
right.
hey, let's pull back the curtain and show what we're doing works. And if
Right.
other people and allow other people to adopt those same things, that's how we'll elevate the care together. Unfortunately, I think what has happened in behavioral health, which we don't see in the medical world as much, is two
Right.
things existing at the same time. You've got
Right.
some of the best programs in the world and some that are not so great at all. And they're able to
Right.
coexist. And as a parent or a family, you're talking to savvy marketers. It can be really difficult to tell the difference. That
Correct.
that is something that has been a priority for me going back 10, 15 years is how do we create more transparency? And then that outcome will be two things, in my opinion, is that we will be able to spread more effective practices and increase access for people. That's a
Mm,
great outcome. The other part of that is programs who are not meeting the standards will be held accountable and they'll not be able to operate because
right.
we'll have the methods to expose that. So I'm pretty passionate about that, and that's why I think the associations like NatSap and you get a lot of critique for being these because they go you'll go back 20 years and a program that closed was an association member. The value in these associations, you've got to have some place to come together where you can have these discussions, and that includes the history. Right. And
Right.
so you pick the baton up where you get it in that process. And our job as leaders is to take that and move it forward. Right.
Right.
And it is very effective to do that with policymakers and with associations because it's just
Right.
an easier way to get programs to adhere. For example, NatSap did not require accreditation. So
Right.
when it started, trade organization, people showed up and we would share learning and you'd go to presentations and there was certainly value in it. But a number of years ago, NatSap made the difficult decision. Well, it was a difficult decision for some to require accreditation. And what happened
Right.
is we lost some members. But it's that important, right? We want the programs that are part of NatSap to be adhering to
Yeah.
the top level, right?
Right.
And
No,
there's still, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, this is why, and again, this isn't, with all due respect, I'm not ripping on JACO or CARF accreditation by any means, but I have desperately, and a lot of my colleagues and I have discussed how we are in such dire need of new licensure and new governing kind of board over treatment, in that lot of things, a lot of stuff is not being really addressed. And so what you're seeing is still is, and this isn't the same for wilderness and everybody with NatSap, but we are seeing, in the residential setting that some people get that stamp of approval from CARF and JACO, and there's still not ethical practices going on there,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
so there needs to be more of these experts who have actually done this work, like yourself, kind of leading the charge and saying, well, these are the things that really need to get the stamp of approval. These are the things that need to be happening. You know what I
Uh-huh.
mean?
You're 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 spot on. You're spot on. I mean, the reality
Thank you.
Joint Commission sets a bar, and that
Right.
bar is looking at best practices in some of these pieces. And if a program can't meet that bar, that's a concern, right? Because it's
Correct.
and they do require in that process that you're tracking some outcomes, but that bar is very, very low. And if I'm a parent, am I more interested that a program is been accredited and meeting the best practices, or am I more interested in the actual outcomes? In other words, can they demonstrate their actual safety, and can they demonstrate their actual effectiveness? Joint
Thank you.
Commission doesn't bring that stuff to the forefront, right?
Right.
They're making
Right.
sure that you have a fire extinguisher and that you've got these ethical practices in place, which is
Right.
great. But I think
Right.
the more important question for us is we've got to be able to lead with, yes, we meet the best practices, we're adhering to these things, and also here's our safety record,
Thank
here's
you.
our outcomes. And I just agree with you. I think that, I think, and here's the cool part is we're starting to see some evolution on this front, and you're starting to see programs. And in the coming years at NatSap, for example, what you will see is more programs evidencing what they do.
Right.
And it's such an important piece. In fact, part of what we're doing with policymakers, and some of this is, I think, been supported by the survivor movement, is, some of the things that need to happen at the policy level have needed to happen for a long time. And
Mhm.
innovators and heroes in this work push to put in some regulations and to hold some of those
Right.
programs accountable. That's why they went out of business. But there's
Right.
still work to do. And
Right.
some of this work now is happening that I'm excited to see, and I want to be a part of those conversations because I want to see the field hold itself accountable.
With that being said, and this is for a completely different episode, and this is something I feel very strongly about too, is when you're talking about like evidence-based, treatment and outcomes, something that I have found frustrating. And I just dealt with this recently with a family, and where they went to their congregation for referrals, and all three programs that this father had given to me to look at for their son, they were all under this bracket of Christ centered and faith based. And again, I have nothing against faith. I have nothing against spirituality, but just like that has nothing to do with the chemo treatment you may be getting for your cancer, or for the, surgery on that broken leg. It should have also nothing to really do is the core of why your loved one is going to, for treatment for mental health and addiction. And what was really unfortunate for me to see is all three programs, there was no outcome studies or evidence-based treatment going on, A, and B, that all I was seeing was this troubled teen word and this behavioral modification. And to me, it's just very dangerous under this kind of guise of Christ-centered. And so I get scared when I hear, and again, this is totally off topic, but when I see and hear about, Robert Kennedy Jr. preaching about how millions and millions of dollars are going to be going into putting out all these faith-based treatments programs all over the country. And again, we're not really talking about, this money being put into what you're talking about, which is more and more of these programs we need to have, be held accountable for what they're doing. And and I think, again, that's another episode for another time. But, I think just to get back on track, I think, I guess, can you explain the difference of what quickly, like what a kid who had gone through something that a Paris Hilton went through, the difference between that and kind of what is the good treatment today?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, fundamentally, right? And you learn this when you go to school as a clinician. One of the
Right.
most important factors in being effective in therapy and that therapy relationship is having trust and having a relationship. And so,
Right.
whether you're going to weekly therapy on an outpatient basis, the effectiveness of that process is largely dependent on how much trust and relationship do you have in the person that you're working with. And so,
Right.
I think, one of the things that I would point to is that what I see, certainly at Legacy and I see in the field, is an absolute focus on providing
Right.
like that we care. And we're going to treat each person that comes through the door as somebody who would be like our own family member, right? And
Hmm.
treat them with that sort of love and respect. And so that's where effectiveness starts, with just love and compassion and a belief that like what we're doing has value, and we're going to engage in these activities and be honest but be caring. And I think that's something that I see largely in this field, is the amount of passion and
Yes.
desire to help people
Right.
is worthy of celebration, right?
Yes.
If
Thank
people
you.
come in and see some of these frontline workers and see some of the guides and some of the clinicians and the hours that they put in and the work that they do and the collaboration and 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 the tools that they try to use to help people, I think that there would be a lot more understanding
Yeah.
and support for the work that we're doing.
No, I often call some of, over the years why I think I am so passionate in the work that I do. And I say more of a connector than I ever was a representative or a rep for a program, is over the years, I would walk into these rooms or go to these programs and I would connect with people where it was magic, where I would see that they were like these angels in human suits. Like I was like, they are doing the good work. They are making a difference. And then I would collect them as people to refer to, because I knew they, some of the most amazing people I have met in the work I've done, especially I see this in this wilderness treatment, it's just like a story like we just shared. Like they just have this way of getting in touch with this kid or young adult or adult that nobody else can do. And I think, leading into the kind of the next question is, who would you consider a good candidate for the work you do and who would not be a good candidate for treatment
Yeah, yeah,
in
yeah.
Legacy and Juniper Canyon?
For sure. And maybe even before that, I'll just share some sort of a thought on that. Is
Yeah.
if we take, for example, the adolescent population, like let's look at like young women, for example. Since 2020, I think this is one of the larger misconceptions in behavioral health care, is that the systems we have put in place, evidence-based systems we have put in place, what it looks like for many families and certainly for young women since 2020, is the steps are: you get a diagnosis and you get a prescription. Prescriptions are up about 64% for that population since 2020. It's
Mm,
massive. So we are
right.
currently treating and I'm not anti-medication by no means, but we are
Right.
using that as the first go-to means of
Right.
treating the population. And what are we getting? The results are getting worse. We're seeing
Right.
anxiety, depression, and isolation. All those things are increasing. So, I don't think those are the means to help. I do think, now picture that those same
And just to
young
say on
women.
that point,
Sure.
just as someone who does struggle with depression and anxiety, and I have a therapist and we talk about this all the time, that's just a piece of my puzzle, right? Taking that med. But if I just did that med alone with nothing else going on, without doing my own DBT practices or, having to, bring nature into my life on the daily or,
Yeah.
connecting with human beings, like that pill doesn't really do anything, right? So you have to, a lot of people I think just say, oh, I'm going to diagnose my kid. They're going to be put on a med and they're going to be fixed. And that's not how it
Yeah.
works.
Well,
Yeah.
absolutely. And if we just look at it in like just a case example of, let's just picture somebody like a legacy client who has, and there's many cases just in this last month that would fit this profile. Somebody who has been isolating, has been gaming, who has not been sleeping, who has high anxiety and depression scores, has been isolating, not engaging in meaningful social activity, all of these pieces. And then imagine them going to a weekly outpatient to work on this stuff while they're existing in that same environment and getting a prescription, which I'm totally fine with on some level.
Yeah.
But now imagine that same person, they come out here and they detox from screens, they detox from substances, they get fresh air, they get to walk through nature, sit around a campfire. It is
Yeah.
intuitive that we're going to
Right.
see healing. In fact, one of the studies that I'm really excited about right now that we're doing is I'm a novice, but it's functional medicine, it's cellular biology. We've watched these clients, the color come back into their eyes and their face. We see them heal. And we've been
Right.
studying it from an emotional behavior standpoint.
Right.
But now we're actually going to look at it from a biological piece, right?
Right.
Is what happens at the cellular level as these guys go through the program and that color comes back to their face, because you see it and parents will report, it's like, this feels like a healthy person, 90
Right.
days later, 60 days later. And so
So true.
yeah. So if we just picture, these adolescents or people who are struggling and we look at their lives, I think it's obvious that a little rites of passage experience is going to provide a likelihood of some positive outcomes. Now,
Right.
at Legacy, we have 2 nurses on staff, we have an MD, and medication is sometimes a part of that process. But I don't think it should be the default,
Right.
because what we're seeing is it's not working. So we've got to do something different. And that
Right.
something different in my mind is we
Plucking
should
you
be
out of that
assessing
environment.
plucking. Yeah. And at the minimum, if I'm a private practice clinician, and this is something I travel around across the country and will teach and present on, I'll be in New York on September 18th we rent out a kayak shop and we take therapists out and we sort of engage in outside activity. But
That's
part of what
awesome.
I encourage clinicians to do as part of your daily practice is ask people how much time they're getting outside. And it
So
might be a
true.
reason. 2 hours a week has been shown to have real positive outcomes. And I think, sometimes just a little inroad to that and then some positive outcome can build on itself. So if I'm a private practice clinician and I'm taking clients, that's definitely something I'm going to be looking at. And I'm going to be working to increase that time for the clients that I work with.
It's so true that you say that. And a couple things on that is like, one is like, of course, especially when I was working the adolescent clients, families try to go the easier, softer approach first, where they're like, all right, well, they're just going to get on a medication. They'll be diagnosed. We'll put them in IOP or PHP, and they'll stay in the same school. They'll be going back into their bedroom and having the same amount of screen time. And they're expecting all this change. And that just doesn't happen. The other piece on that is I personally never went into a wilderness setting for treatment when I went to treatment as a young adult. But I will say this, in my adult life, anytime I have gone for doing intensive work where I've gone away for a week or a few days, it is amazing to me how much actually gets done and achieved when somebody pulls my phone away from me and puts me in this kind of, I'm not in the wilderness, but I'm definitely on a farm with animals and I don't have my phone and I am amongst, people that are not in my daily life. And the change in it has such a profound effect on you. It really does. And the work really gets done because you don't have any more of those distractions and any more of that stuff in your way. And that's why I do call it somewhat of a wilderness intervention. You get back to basics, I mean, I
Yeah.
saw that. Yeah. Go on.
And I mean, add to that, imagine being a person struggling, right? And
Right.
you're struggling. And so you go to therapy and you go in that process, you get a medication, and then you're, like you said, you're still existing in that same environment, living the same way, and those struggles continue in some way. That could be
Correct.
very, very discouraging. And
Very.
sometimes what happens in that process is people will develop this inner identity that I'm uniquely broken.
Right.
And that can be counterproductive sometimes. And so, by providing somebody an opportunity for facilitated success, where it's, hey, we're going to go and achieve and we're going to do things and we're going to walk alongside you. When you get to the top of a mountain, then you get that reward and you feel this, you've achieved something because you've been a part of the planning and you're getting excited and then you do it. I think that sometimes you can see more movement through getting someone to walk alongside you up a mountain to see the view
Right.
than, certainly a weekly session where they're going back and struggling with the same things. Sometimes that can be counterproductive. And so I do think sometimes the interventions, particularly with youth, we need to be more proactive around how do we engage them in activities that's going to get those results, as
Right.
opposed to solely focusing on identifying their unique problem, because that
Right.
gets internalized.
Right.
And I think that, our westernized models are a little bit obsessed with diagnosis, assessment, and medication, and a little
Right.
less focused on how do we facilitate meaningful activity. Back in the day, we had more healthy rites of passage. People would grow and they would be exposed to these real world scenarios, and they would build character and they'd build strength. We're protecting kids maybe too much from being able to have character building, resiliency building experiences. And so, I don't think there's anything that can be more profound for someone
Right.
to do than to go backpack around, go to a
Right.
camp, go with your family. Wilderness
Right.
therapy I think is a great option if you really need to work on some stuff, but there's a lot of ways to tap into this wisdom for kids who are struggling that I don't think we talk about enough.
Can we also briefly just touch on this? Because we talked about this before we started recording, and this is something I also see families freak out about. And it did happen to a lot of kids in the past. I think, Derek and I were talking about this kind of, and I do agree. I think it's this lazy option of transporting one's, listen, when you have an adolescent, a young adult, an adult, and I've worked with everybody. I've worked with pilots. I've worked with adults. I've worked with WWE wrestlers. I've worked with the gamut. And 9 times out of 10, nobody, including myself, is willing and wanting to walk through that door, whether it's into wilderness treatment or into treatment. But I think, there was this kind of what we would call the snatch and grab, which is these transports in the middle of the night would come and pick up a child and wake them up at 3 a.m. and grab them and take them into a wilderness setting or an adolescent treatment setting, which can be kind of traumatizing, if not very traumatizing. I am not a huge advocate of that type of intervention. I screen all of my transports and interventionists that I use. They have to be super licensed. They have to be able to be equipped to handle anything and everything. And I just find this kind of coming in the middle of the night, pulling someone out of their bed, not only not appropriate, but just really, it's traumatic. So I think and I just want to stress on this, and we can talk on this for a minute, because this isn't the norm, guys. This isn't what everybody does to intervene on an adolescent and young adult. In the 20 years that I've been working with adolescents and young adults, have never had to go that route. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Because I
Yeah,
know some
no,
parents will not, they'll immediately, and this happened just this week when we were trying to refer a young woman to Juniper Canyon. This mom was like, "Oh, I'm not doing this. They're going to kidnap my kid in the middle of the night," and da 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 da. And so,
yeah.
what do you say to that?
Yeah, no, I think it's an important conversation. I think similar to wilderness therapy, transport sort of got that like catch-all, right? And I think
Right.
that the actual
And
story
that's what did
behind
happen
that.
to Paris. And I
Yeah,
understand that is part of
yeah.
her story. That was a very true part of her story, and that does happen still. So,
For sure. And so I think the term sort of got flattened into catching what you're describing there. And, I think similarly to you, I've been answering phone calls and helping families for 20 years. And I
right.
think that, a couple of things that I would point out is that if I'm looking at using those services because I have an adolescent in real distress and this happens,
Correct.
then first and foremost, work with a licensed and accredited service who provides safe passage or adolescent intervention that
Thank you.
are not going to be using those tactics and are not
Yes.
going to be using deceit. And because
Right.
adolescent intervention I think is really appropriate. The other piece that I would add to it that I just see it, and because I get these calls and I've had to help family members, that I think gets overlooked is we often think about like transport, that person that you're talking about. We've got an adolescent who's maybe getting a little bit of trouble and parents just don't want to deal with it. So they call transports to come in the middle of the night.
Mm.
That shouldn't happen. And I think that the field in large part, and the transportation type services, I don't see that practices. It may still exist, and there's maybe some transporters out there still operating
It
like
does
that. And
exist. I mean,
and we
I've had
shouldn't.
to, yeah,
And I
unfortunately,
think
it
that
still
that's where,
does.
similarly, transporters should be, and I see them advocating to try to raise the bar so that
Thank
kind of
you.
practice no longer exists. The
Right.
flip side of that I think is important is, and these are real stories that happen. There's one that happened for me a month ago. It was a family member, and they called me in distress, and they had a family member who was an adolescent who was running down the street, taking his clothes off, right, and
Mm.
having a real psychotic break. It was scary. It was terrifying. And they were faced with a decision. Who do we call for support? And I
Right.
recommended they call Safe Passage people to come and help provide some care, because I think sometimes when you're dealing with a crisis like that, the best thing you could do is call for support from people
Mm.
who are trained and who are not
Yes.
carrying guns,
Thank you.
because having police officers show up to these things is not a
Mm-mm.
better alternative.
No, it's horrible.
And so, and people would, I think, would make the case that that's the minority, not from where I'm sitting. From where I'm sitting,
Right.
the vast majority of these cases, when we talk about them on an individual case, it's people being put in the worst possible decisions, where you've got people
Right.
being trafficked, abused,
Right.
and it's, some of this stuff is really scary. And as a parent, when somebody has psychosis, for example, and is going down the
Yes.
road, the
Yeah.
most compassionate thing we can do is certainly not do anything.
Right.
Leave them. I think that there's a portion of the population who is homeless or untreated, and I
Right.
don't think that that's the more compassionate alternative. When
Right.
somebody's on the edge and they're at real risk, I think it's
Right.
okay for families to draw a boundary and intervene.
Thank
Now,
you.
I think the practices of like adult intervention should
Right.
be the go-to. And there's no reason
Right.
why we can't take those same approaches
Thank
with
you. Yep.
adolescents.
And
With adults at Legacy, it's great because everyone at Legacy is choosing to be here. Now, we might have
mhm.
some clients who come post-intervention, but they're
Right.
provided choice in that process, always.
Right.
And before they arrive, they get on a phone call with me and I answer every question.
Right.
And if they show up and they're here for a week and a half and they decide this is not for them, they're an adult.
Yeah.
We're going to do our best to work with them and say, hey, we know, but it's their choice. And so we might have someone who comes for a week and says, this isn't for me. With adolescents, it's a little more nuanced. And I understand that.
But I will say, and I'll throw a name in there because just I've interviewed her before and she will be coming back on. And she is kind of my go-to for when we talk about licensure and or being licensed and credentialed. I've been working with Heather Hayes for years. And, her transports and her team are just super licensed and super credentialed. And I think, why, to me, a true intervention of sorts is about working with the family, sometimes up until a month or two prior than this individual going into treatment. Was I willing to go to treatment? Did I want to go to treatment? Did I not kick my dad's car when I was being dropped off as a young adult into treatment? Like, I did have a choice, but my mother, prior to me going in, was being guided by those credentialed people saying, listen, as long as we get the messaging from you set up and sorted and working with you and understanding that, Hannah's going to kick and scream. Hannah's not going to maybe want to go in, but maybe, from a loving place. And it's not about tough love, but it's loving differently, where my mother said, I love you. You don't have to stay. You're an adult. You can walk out tomorrow. But I'm going to tell you right now, we're not paying for your apartment anymore. We're cutting up your credit cards. We're not making it so cushy for you to have an out, for me to save my life, and I think, and again, I dealt with this again recently, just with a family who were like, I don't want to lie to my kids. So I'm going to tell them about the intervention before the intervention happens. And, and we're going to have this coach that we have found who has no credentials and no license, anything, to kind of guide us in informing our kid about what the next steps are. It can just screw everything up, and it really do more damage than anything. And again, we don't look at an intervention as we're lying to anybody. It's more about this family intervention, which it is, to work with a family to, in a loving way, present options and present, we have done the research, we've done our due diligence. These are the two or three of the great programs that we have chosen. Now you can call them and pick one that you're comfortable with, but we're going to be going with one of them. I think where where the snatch and grab, as we call it, or this kind of transport in the middle of the night got really lazy, is parents didn't have to do anything. They didn't have to lift a finger. They were just like, all right, you're just going to come in. We don't even have to be at the house when they're here. You'll just grab them. We'll be on vacation and you'll bring them. And that defeats the purpose, because, as I always say, it's easy to maybe get somebody through the door in the first 24 hours. The real work is to keep them there. And to keep them there, a lot of times we have to be working with the families ahead of time with messaging and, everyone needs to be on the same team, your parting words. Like, if there's one thing you want that caller to hear, about the work you do or about this process to walk away with, what would it be? Like, what would be the one thing that you would just hope families would be hearing as they get off the phone with you?
Yeah, I think what I would share is that I've watched people transform and get to healthy places for years and years and years. And so no
Yeah.
matter how difficult the story that I hear, I
Yeah.
work from a belief and a place that like we can get to a healthier place. Now, depending on the individual circumstances, the roadmap to get there may look differently for individuals. If we've got somebody who's just in college and struggling a little bit and just needs some time, I can predict that we're going to see some clinical outcomes in fairly short order. But the other thing that I would tell parents is that sometimes, it's hard for the help and the support that they're offering to be appreciated in real time. And that's okay.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's difficult to be a parent or be a loved one
Right.
to make hard decisions. And, to go back to what we were just talking about, I think one of the things that we should refrain from ever doing is judging people for making hard decisions and
Nah. Yeah.
for people trying to do the best they can to get help. And I think that
Right.
you said it, if we can work together better,
Right.
I think the most fruitful parts of these conversations are the places where we get into the nitty gritty and maybe have different perspectives on how we get to a better level. Like it's okay
Right.
that we don't like everyone doesn't have to agree across the board. But I don't think villainizing anyone in this process, whether it be the parents or the
Right.
clients or the youth
Right.
or safe passage interventionists, the program people, that's not going to help anyone get to a better place,
Right.
and it's not going to create better outcomes.
No, and I think thank you for saying that. I think, every family I speak to on the phone, they start with this kind of shame or guilt that they are a bad parent because of this is happening. And my outlook is, and I've said this before, I don't, my mother, who was the best mom in the world, was not equipped for handling what I was going through, where I was slowly killing myself because of my mental health and because, of a lot of things going on in my life. She didn't know how to, mom me through that, right? She had to, and I say this to families all the time, once you find the right programs and the right professionals to really listen to those people, you have hired them now, you are leaning on them. So please, with all due respect, like let them guide you. I think where parents do a disservice is when, they have all this knowledge and they have all this information and they are hearing time and time again from these experts, on how to do this, and they still choose to do it their way. We've touched on a lot of good things today. So I wanted to thank you again, Derek, for coming on. In the show notes, you will see more of Derek's bio. You will also be able to see and touch these websites of the programs that Derek's working with. We will also have NatSAP's information, so you can see all the programs that have kind of been the golden standard of the work out there that's being done for these young adults and adolescents. So I just wanted to say thank you again for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. Thanks for hosting these conversations again. They're so important. And if I can encourage people, if you get a chance this week, go for a walk, go breathe some
Thank
fresh
you.
air, go get some sunlight, and ponder some of these questions. I think the best that we can do is to gather information, create context, and make the most informed decisions we can. In the meantime, go outside, get fresh air, and
So
see for
true.
yourself. Yeah.
So true. All right. Thanks again. And this is another episode of Connect Call. We'll see you next week.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Connect Call. As we conclude, remember that insights shared are intended for informational and educational purposes only and should not substitute professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. We strongly recommend consulting a qualified medical health professional or healthcare provider for personalized advice tailored to your unique needs. Your mental health journey is important, and having the right support is essential. If you're experiencing a mental health crisis or require immediate assistance, please reach out to a mental health provider or emergency services in your area. We're grateful to have you as part of our community, and your well-being remains our priority. So follow us on social media to stay connected, and be sure to catch one of our episodes on our YouTube channel. We're here to support you every step of the way.